Welcome so much, and thank you for coming in this afternoon. My name is Elaine Yao. I'm one of the organizing curators for BAM PFA's iteration of Candice Lin, Seeping, Rotting, Resting, Weeping. I will just briefly introduce our speakers so we can get right into today's conversation. So first, Candice Lin is an artist whose interdisciplinary practice addresses the porous boundaries of self and other, prodding at the ways that materials and colonial histories construct categories of gender, race, species, and deviance. Her investigations have taken visitors to places both weirdly fascinating and macabre, along routes of natural history and global trade in commodities like porcelain, cochineal, medicinal plants, and in this exhibition, indigo. An assistant professor at UCLA, Lin has received numerous awards and exhibits nationally and globally, including this year's Venice Biennale. At the center, Mel Y. Chen is associate professor of gender and women's studies at UC Berkeley and director of the Center for the Study of Sexual Culture. They are the author of Animacies, Biopolitics, Racial Matterings, and Queer Affect, that explores questions of racialization, gender queering, disability, and affective economies, as well as a forthcoming book, Intoxicated, which considers ideas of toxicity and intoxication, coursing through 19th century archival histories of race and disability. A prolific writer of contemporary art criticism, Chen has contributed to numerous exhibition catalogs and art books, including Candice Lin, A Hard White Body from 2019. So it's wonderful that you two are together again this afternoon. And finally, Victoria Sung. She is an associate curator of visual arts at the Walker Arts Center, Minneapolis, where she works with artists to create exhibitions, publications, and public programs. In addition to co-organizing this exhibition with the Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts at Harvard University, she has curated solo shows with Sia Armajani, Theaster Gates, Laura Provost, Rayan Tibet, and Shen Shin. Currently, she is organizing an upcoming retrospective and catalog on Pasita Abad, which will open at the Walker next spring and later at SF MoMA in the fall of 2023. Thank you, each of you, for making time today. And with that, I'll hand over the mic to the three of you.
Elaine, thank you so much for those introductions. And as Elaine said, my name is Victoria, and I'm so thrilled to be up here with both Mel and Candice. And I think the event record promised a wide-ranging conversation, so I think it will definitely be wide-ranging, and we'll see kind of what we get up to in this next hour. So we will be talking, I think, for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up and would love to, have questions from all of you and have a little bit more of an intimate dialogue. So I think this talk is actually very exciting for us because it's pretty rare actually for an exhibition to open. So this exhibition opened at the Walker a little over a year ago, and it's rare to actually have the opportunity to kind of think back on an exhibition 1 year later, because we're always kind of in the mode of looking forward or looking to what's next. So I think it's a really incredible opportunity for us to reflect and kind of unpack maybe the exhibition 1 year down the road. And so I think it might be helpful for everyone if we set the stage a little bit in terms of how this exhibition came together. And so Elaine mentioned that it was an exhibition that lived previously in Minneapolis and then also at the Carpenter Center, which is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Dan Byers, who was the co-curator, and I approached Candice, and it was with the invitation to do a commission. And for those of you who may not be so familiar with what that process looks like, curators will invite an artist to make a new work or make a new body of work, and it's a really open-ended invitation. And so we had zero clue of where Candace would go with this exhibition, although, of course, we're familiar with kind of previous bodies of work and her working process. But I thought it might be helpful for everyone if we just give a little insight, Candace. If you feel comfortable, you'll have to kind of dig deep back into your memory of kind of how you approach this project and your making of the work 2 to 3 years ago. But I thought we might start with that process of how the work came together.
Yeah, I feel like I had been doing work about the history of different colonial goods like sugar and cochineal, and I knew that I wanted to do some research into indigo. And so I think I said something like that was the initial seed of the thing, but then it was during the beginning of the pandemic, summer 2020, and I got really into crafting mode because I was working from home. I filled my kiddie pool with indigo. I really wanted to just make clothing, so a lot of these panels are actually also panels that double as clothes. I was hanging out with my cat a lot. And at some point, the work just really shifted from my way of working in the past, which was more closely tied to the research and the history kind of the material. And it became more intuitive and more like connected to the pleasure of touch and what I was making, and what Roger thought of it as he went around and sniffed the different things I was making in the backyard.
Roger is Candace's cat.
Oh yeah, Roger is my cat. And and White and Gray was his uncle, who died that summer, who also, before he disappeared, showed up on the porch with blue legs. So I had taken a little dip in the indigo. Wait, did I answer?
No, definitely. Well, I mean, I feel like you said so much there, so maybe we can like tease it apart a little bit. But you mentioned that you previously have been really interested in researching, the colonial histories of things like porcelain and cochineal, and you were really interested in diving into indigo here. Mm-hmm. Can you just talk very briefly about that history of indigo? And it might be helpful for people to get that context.
Yeah, so a lot of the research I was doing before was thinking about plants that were related to different plantation economies, like sugarcane, and indigo is also one of those plants I was interested in. I was interested in the global trade of indigo-dyed textiles, and so some of the patterns that I hand-cut with these stencils have references to those historical patterns that are moments of global trade, where one culture is kind of influencing the visual outcome of the imagery. So there's some patterns that are related to British colonial occupation of Nigeria and India, and Portuguese and Dutch influences on Japanese textiles. So that was more like aligned with how I was thinking about my research before. There weren't cats. Well, there were probably cats, but not in an overt way. I felt really embarrassed the whole time I was making the show, and every time we would have like a meeting, I'd be like, oh, I'm so embarrassed. And then you guys were like, why are you so embarrassed? But I think it was just because I hadn't made work before that I didn't know how to talk about. And it actually, the first time we talked at the Walker opening, I still didn't know what the show was about necessarily, and was still deep in the embarrassment, which I'm coming out of, I guess. And I think a lot of that embarrassment was just the kind of unsureness of what felt like maybe self-indulgence in terms of the imaginative and personal worlds I allowed to enter the work. But it's been nice that since the show's been up, it's been a pretty positive response. So it makes me feel maybe it's okay or something.
Well, I think it's so interesting when you talk about this kind of, embarrassment that you were feeling as you're making the work. And earlier you mentioned too that this maybe process diverged a little bit from how you approached previous works, and that it was much more intuitive and coming from a place of maybe uncertainty of what the end, result might be. And I feel like that's kind of aligns actually with the best way that a commissioning process can happen, where you don't have, a distinct idea of how you're going to get to the end or what that end looks like, but you really are kind of giving over fully to the exploration. And I think what I love so much about this exhibition, actually, in the gallery, for you all, if you've had a chance to walk through, there's a journal. What is it? It's called the Pandemic Diary, or I'm forgetting the exact title.
I think it's called A Journal of Plague Year Cat Demon Diary.
Yes. So there's this journal of, the plague year, which started off kind of for you as, like a fabric scrapbook and capturing bits of the actual physical making process of the works, but then also becomes this really vulnerable diary where you're recording your thoughts during the pandemic, or moments of, your response to anti-Asian violence, or there's very specific, it just reads like a very personal diary. So to put that out and share that publicly, I thought was such a courageous move, and gives everyone so much insight into what you were thinking as you were making.
Yeah, it's funny. There's more embarrassing stuff too, because I also wrote notes to my friends that I missed, but I didn't tell them that I did that. They're just tiny notes with drawings. And then I had done a talk at my friend Christine Thompson's university, and I didn't realize that I had a picture in the slides of the page where it says really small, "I miss you, Christine." I was so embarrassed by that, but I think she was touched. But I was like, oh, I didn't mean to show that page. That's weird.
Do you want to talk a little bit about, in terms of process, the different processes that you used to make the works? You mentioned your kiddie pool with indigo dye, so there's indigo dyeing here, but what other tactile processes were you drawing on?
Yeah, the indigo was a very stinky tactile process. I did a lot of tests with different kinds of vats. Some of you probably know you can make your indigo dye vat in a different number of different ways, with urine or old fruit or iron. So I tested different ones out before making the giant kiddie pool version. And then the method is rice paste resist. So you make kind of rice bran, rice paste dumplings, and which sounds delicious. And also the rats in my studio really like to eat the designs off of my drawings after I had laboriously stenciled them and drew them. And I had a war with the rats for a while over this. And then you dye the dried rice paste resist fabric into the dye. And then the rugs, it's a little sad to see them because they're quite faded now, but the rugs were also dyed, but with synthetic dyes. And done in my yard. The two works in the back, the tactile theaters, those are concrete and a material that's plaster and pigment called scagliola, which I learned is not scagliola. It's just scagliola. Because I was trying to tell an Italian curator about it, and they were like, "What are you talking about?" And I'm like, "Scagliola," and they were like, "No, it's just scagliola." But it's just a cool technique where you can make it look like faux marble, and that process sucked because it was so much polishing. All the fingers were worn away. What other materials are in here? Oh, ceramics. And the ceramics, yeah, that's a material process.
Of hand building. And what I thought was so interesting also, Candace made all this work, as you said, during the pandemic. And so you didn't actually have access to you teach at UCLA, and so you didn't have access to the studio where you would normally make works of this scale. And so she was making all of this in her home and backyard. And I think that's why you said initially you had to maybe
make them in sections.
Make the sculptures in sections to fire them.
Yeah. Oh, and then the video, I worked with a former student of mine, artist Yotam Mendelevi. He was learning this software, and I was so intrigued, and I wanted him to teach me, and he did teach me a little, and then I got stuck, so then I just asked if I could hire him to help me animate this figure that I made. And it's based on this.
Yeah, but is it, so you made it out of clay?
I made it out of clay. I 3D scanned it and then brought it into Cinema 4D, where Yotam helped me animate the movements to be based on this Qigong video that my parents watch of this white guy doing Qigong. That I was like, I really love this Qigong, and it'd be much more fun to watch a cat do it. So that was actually my first impetus of making it, was to like have a video of the cat doing the same video for my parents. But it was too hard, so it's not the full length of the one that they watch. Yeah.
Well, I feel like we need to talk about cats, and I feel like, Mel, maybe this is where you can come in, because I think yesterday when we were talking, you had a really interesting question about if Candace was embodying a cat, or I don't know if you want to ask how you.
We had so much fun last night, and already this has begun so much more seriously than I anticipated, so I'm trying to adjust. In the meantime, I'm noticing a lot of laughter in the room, and I want to talk about that a little later. But this cat, I heard from my friend Vivian Huang, who you just met, that she was here and felt encouraged to mimic the cat and do the Qigong moves along with the video. And while she was standing here, a child who had come in with their mother announced, "I'm coming to do these moves with you." And this really speaks, this is just the latest example, which speaks to the kind of rich invitation to various forms of encounter that I think your work consistently has. And it's I'll make a personal confession here, which is that when I watch a movie, I become the movie star. So in The Matrix, I became Neo. In those Tom Cruise movies, Mission Impossible, I become Tom Cruise. But it is also about gestural feeling, and so maybe I'm especially drawn to your work in the way that it really invokes a gestural response, and so it's overwhelmingly pleasurable for me to engage in these ways. But there are all kinds of gestures here, right? And when I think about gesture, I'm not thinking about gestural systems of communication necessarily, but things that might be at the edge of that, that still have meaning. So these loaf positions of the cat headrests have immense meaning, and they're also inviting a kind of lying down in relation to those objects. The video, the tactile theater, we in some ways get to also become differently and gesturally in relation to your work. And I was wondering if you wanted to say more about that. You want a question?
Yeah, I don't know how to.
Wait.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, I know. It is. It's a weird.
You have a thought about it, Vicky?
Well, I mean, I think yeah, I echo, Mel, what you're saying. And when we first experienced the exhibition, it was so pleasurable because it kind of felt like, as a visitor, like you became almost cat-like to experience the space. And, you know, I think even when you were talking about how this work came from more of an intuitive place as opposed to necessarily like a cognitive place, not that it's all embedded in the work, but there's so much more of an emphasis on touch and feeling and, you know, the sensorial nature of everything, that, yeah, I feel, Mel, when you're talking about kind of this embodied gesture in terms of the making of the work, but then also in terms of the, you know, visitor's response, it's quite interesting to connect those two.
And that,
you're
about to speak.
No, I was just going to say that one time a student of mine was like, "You're making a funny face." And I'm like, "Oh, I am." And they're like, "Yeah, you're like," and I'm like, "Oh, that's because I'm trying to sculpt that. Like it hadn't come onto the clay yet, but in my head I was thinking of it. So I was like, as I was like trying to like do the face so I think like you do have to embody gesture for all of you makers in the audience. Like, and it happens when people are painting or drawing or whatever, you know, like I think it just kind of unconsciously happens that you make your body into the thing you're trying to represent.
Well, that's interesting because this whole thing makes me think about representation. There's a really ungenerous way of thinking about representation. All this criticism about it in that it's kind of an alienated cognitive representation of something, and so it's sort of distant from the thing. But the process you're describing feels different because it's a surfacing of something, not a report, right? And I think that's partly what I'm moved by, and I think what viewers of the work are literally being moved by. They're not viewing a report; they are becoming in relation to something.
Yeah, I hope so. That would be nice.
And I think, I mean, earlier, Candace, too, when you're saying like you like take on these, you know, gestures of a cat, or, you know, sometimes you'll like sniff around or make these motions. I was just thinking too, as both of you were talking, to the video that's in the tent on, you know, a small little monitor of White and Gray, your other cat. And in that piece, you actually do kind of narrate like from a first person perspective, as if like White and Gray were speaking in a way that we could understand. So it's interesting to think about, yeah, how you were maybe embodying different feline friends in the making.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking at dinner about like intimacy and connection and how that's often done through opening up this internal world that we all have, where we're like, or maybe we don't all have this because it's an assumption, but I imagine that most people, they like, you know, they're watching another species that maybe they don't know or one they live with, and they hear like a monologue. Is that something everyone does? And so, yeah, I think like letting it be voiced in the exhibition is maybe a way of also extending that inner world and that intimacy. I remember also with this video, there's a moment where the genitals blink, and when I was talking to Yotam about it, I just was like, yeah, you know, because that pose, you're here and then you come down and then the face down here has to blink. That's just what always happens when I do that move. And he was like, what? But it was just more like an internal feeling that something comes down there and blinks. And so anyway, that happens in there. Talking about gesture. I don't know.
Was that did you just bow your head with embarrassment?
Yeah.
I'm so grateful for your being willing to become embarrassed. And I marked down that I highly recommend this catalog. There's so much in it, and I looked at it again last night or this morning, just anticipating this conversation. But I think in one of the pieces, I don't remember which one, maybe Dan's, there was a description of the thinking you did to begin to allow yourself to do this kind of work. And it was, I shouldn't, but I will. I shouldn't, but I will. And I think that your work can be very sly and mischievous, and my partner Julia calls it witchy in all the best ways. I shouldn't, but I will also makes me feel about like unfaithfulness. And there's a way that, coming back to your original question about this meticulous research that you do, and you do it for this as well, but that there was something about being faithful to the research so that it gets surfaced in a fairly direct way, compared to this, which I'm just curious about that embarrassment. I don't want to embarrass you further, but maybe to objectify it a little bit. There are these feelings that are happening with this show, not just embarrassment, but also joy and forms of pleasure that maybe the earlier work wasn't always inviting in such a direct way. Even pleasure and laughter can have an undertow of sort of a painful, a sort of a painful past. And when I laugh, when I see this, I experience that as well. Is there any aspect of that you'd like to say more on?
Yeah, I mean, I got stuck on the word faithful. I think there's two things in there I want to respond to. There's like, I think when your research, like a lot of mine deals with really violent and heavy histories that are still living into the present, there's a feeling of weight and responsibility to be faithful, to surface and make accessible these histories that maybe don't get talked about. So a lot of the earlier work maybe was holding that solemnness forward. But I do also think that humor is important to make those things, like, to allow those things to be felt deeply in a way that's like, I don't know, yeah, I think people do sometimes laugh because there's like an uncomfortable recognition that's painful and absurd or something. So I think part of the embarrassment was like, again, like the feeling that the show was so self-indulgent with this really heavy subject matter that should be held with care. But then I also do think there's value in the role of imagination within that, and also of humor and playfulness, but not in a necessarily lighthearted way.
This is we were talking last night about all of the ways in which weirding has meaning, especially as we think about your work. You mentioned it in your piece. We mentioned it in our piece, the piece I co-wrote with Julia Bryan Wilson, and Dan mentioned queer weirding, right? And I think so. Yeah, I just went back, and so there's this for me also maybe a kind of queer valence about remixing without necessarily losing the solemn and the intense and the joyful, but in a kind of unfamiliar mixture, right? But something that releases a different way of surfacing or experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, just as both of you were talking, something that's coming to my mind is something this feminist scholar, Astrida Neimanis, I think is how you say her name. They said something interesting around like scales of mattering, and this notion that, as you were just saying, Candice, it's like you were making this work, during the pandemic. There were so many, serious things, of course, going on in the world related to the pandemic, and then all these catastrophic wildfires here in California where you were also making the work, and all of this was going on, and in some ways you felt like, I think you said shame or like, some embarrassment in making work that you felt like was self-indulgent. And it just reminds me, in your journal that's on view, there's this page where you call out like public grief and sadness and panic, and I can't remember what other words you use, and then also juxtaposed with kind of this private solace. And I feel like this, like, as Mel is saying, like this mixing or weirding, I guess just to go back to this notion of like scales and mattering, it's like the human experience is weird, right? It's like we're bringing in all these different things that matter on a different scale, but like collapsing it all into like our own individual human experience. And I guess that's kind of how just as both of you were talking, I was like, there's this like interesting weirding that's going on, and it kind of maps out onto our own individual experiences being weird. So I don't know, do you want to talk a little bit about like weirding? It's, I mean, as a verb, but also like weird as an adjective. I feel like there's so much we can unpack with you and your work. And we say weird in like the best possible way. Like it's a very like exciting weird.
Candace warned us that there might be moments of resistance.
where we're met with her meowing. So this is one. I heard some small I'm resisting the meowing. I don't know how to respond to that. Well, I mean, should we talk about different ways maybe where like weirding maybe, comes up in the making of the work, or... I mean, right there. Yeah.
Can I add another dimension that might?
Yes, please.
I think weirding for us is also working in this way that, like, certainly for me, Julie and I went and saw a different exhibition of yours in Chinatown in the middle of the pandemic, and it had an extra significance, I think, given the ways COVID was being racialized, and there were these extra tensions both within the economy of Chinatown and the question of what Asianness means at this moment. And this work is wonderfully confusing in that it's refusing to play the stories we're normally fed, Orientalist stories, stories about quote-unquote first and third worlds, stories about how time works, past and present, modernity and primitivity. So, there's a way, right, in which being in a museum and being presented with any image of Qigong practices tells you something about what you're supposed to think about ancient non-modern practices, right? And that are somehow exterior to whatever this space is that we're in, right? And but you don't let that happen. You deeply mess with it, right? With this profusion, a planned profusion, and yet a profusion of objects and symbolic meaning that normally organizes itself fairly well. And I deeply appreciate that. But for me, that's also an aspect of this weirding that I very much have needed, as a kind of anti-colonial gesture, and a fairly unique one in the way that you do it.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder also if, like, all the time with ourselves allowed for that internal fermenting to get weirder. Yeah, I don't know why this one is like, I don't know how to respond to this one, because it's also, when it's your own world, it's also not weird. It's just your world. But you're talking about like more like, what is it? How does it function in the world, right? Like that it comes obliquely at these.
You're basically pointing out why you shouldn't be the one to have to answer this question.
I just don't know how. Yeah, or what the question is. Yeah, like I liked the way that it came up in the writing, but I don't know how to elaborate on it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think even like concrete examples, like we're looking at these, ceramic sculptures, and it was fascinating for us to like understand like the very disparate sources from which you were like basing some of these figures on. And I don't know if you can speak a little bit to that. That might be helpful.
Yeah, so the central figures, there's a couple of different mixes, but the central figures come from this guy, George Salazar, who in the 18th century, he was probably a white Frenchman, European of some kind, who pretended to be from Formosa, present-day Taiwan. And he wrote a really elaborate pseudo-ethnography of Formosa, including a religion that had an idol of the devil that was, he made a drawing of. And so some of the multiple faces is reference to that drawing. But then there's also references to the kind of Tang Dynasty funeral guardian demons that I just saw at the Asian Art Museum. Those are great. And then, and then there's other references that are less strong, but different for fertility, ceramic figures and stuff.
Yeah, and actually, I think in the back of this gallery, there are they weren't direct references for you, but you helped select different objects, right, from the collection.
Yeah, that was a cool invitation to get to pick out works. And that is much more unconscious thing, because you just grow up with certain kinds of decor, and then you absorb it, and then you later see an image and you're like, oh, I drew something that looks like remarkably like this thing, but I didn't think consciously of it. But there are like that multi-faced creature back there, maybe was something that influenced Salazar's drawing, but it's also just like an image you see. And that maybe relates also to the Asian weirding, because we talked about that a little bit, like specifically diasporic, like what does it mean to grow up also with some alienation to your parents' culture, and to receive like the images that hang on your house but don't necessarily know the context or the understanding fully. And so then you have your own narratives around what the scary picture that you talk to before you go to bed is, but it actually has its whole other meaning. So there's that kind of weirding.
And unfaithful, right? Unfaithful weirding. Something that many of us, diasporically are striving to kind of achieve a level of comfort with, right? Like that unfaithfulness, inevitable unfaithfulness.
I mean, I think, it's so interesting to put like the unfaithfulness and the weirding, they're all definitely resonate with one another. And I think this notion of like weird, I love, and I'm thinking about an essay that this writer wrote, Mitchell S. Jackson, where he talks about like who gets to be weird. And I'm going to paraphrase it terribly, I think, but basically I think he was saying like, to be weird, you have to have some semblance of freedom, or at least the perception that you have some sort of freedom, whatever, it could be personal freedom, political freedom. And so I think it was so interesting to kind of observe, from the sidelines as you were making this work, because there was an unfaithfulness, as Mel talks about, unfaithful, like, to the historical reference. Like, I felt like there was a freedom there where you didn't feel like you had to stick so much, or maybe you didn't feel that, like, burden or responsibility of having to tell that history so faithfully, and that from that grounding, like, you could kind of weird things yourself. Like, there was this, like, freedom and playfulness that came from maybe that groundswell of knowledge that you had kind of built up over the years. That's not much of a question, but
I think that's true. But I think also, and I noticed this happening in a lot of my students' work, that I think that pandemic's been a really hard time. So I think it was also not just a freedom to do that, but an urgency for one's own getting through this. Like, for me, I think a lot of the moving towards allowing myself to draw cats and make these narratives that, like, I took joy from, be part of the work, was like, I just got pleasure and happiness out of it, and I didn't have a lot of other ways to get that during that time. So it was also a survival mechanism, I think, too.
And I think you said, actually, that during the pandemic, like, the person you would see the most was your cat, right? Like, Roger was, like, the human, non-human actor in your life that you would like interact with the most. So it is interesting how, I guess, cats kind of really become such a prominent protagonist.
I just wanted to quickly add that I think one of the phrases that appeared in your notes for our talk today was interspecies assemblages, and I think the way in which Roger and you were so richly encountering each other speaks, and then you're allowing yourself the embarrassing aspect of surfacing cats and catness and the pleasures of catness into this exhibition, I think does something around, like, constructing different kinds of assemblages that I think, for me at least, in part result in my asking what a cat is anymore, and therefore also what other objects are that participate in the assemblages you're offering, right? And in what Dan Beyer says is a kind of future present orientation, right? So there's something about that sort of bringing in and then allowing assemblages to do something a little different. It's also very much characteristic of your previous work. But,
Yeah, well, I think we're at, the 45-minute mark, so we'd love to open it up for questions. If anyone has, anything you want to
I'm going to pass the mic around so that, you can be recorded along with everything else. Thank you, by the way. This is a wonderful program. So, any questions or comments?
Yeah, they can really, please feel free to say something that doesn't make sense.
I wanted to speak on how the role of femininity plays in your work, and wanted to ask how much you reflected on that during the pandemic specifically, and how that played into this exhibition.
Sorry, did you say the role of the many? Is that right?
Femininity.
Oh, femininity.
To be honest, I don't think I was thinking that much about femininity, even though they're is a real interest in like craft, which is seen as feminine, like textiles that I've been really interested in working on, and ceramics. But yeah, I don't know, because I actually felt more close to my non-human imaginings, and those aren't really gendered in the same way for me. So maybe it wasn't that personally close to my femininity in the making of the work. But there definitely is like an investment and valuation of feminine craft, historically feminine craft.
Anyone else?
First of all, thank you so much for such an amazing work. It's very, very profound, and it really moved me to think about many, many different things and aspects and mythology. And yeah, thank you. And secondary, so the installation reminds me the tradition of caravanserai. It's a thing mostly familiar with the Silk Road, right? When there were some, in Asia and in Africa, some constructions by the road, some buildings where people who travel and take the Silk Road, they can have some rest, right? And it's very interesting because you were talking a lot about joy and some entertainment and this happiness, which I guess these travelers were experiencing when they were having a moment to rest after a long road, taking the Silk Road. And so this what reminds me, it made me immediately think about this place where we as travelers, as visitors, can have a moment to breathe. And which is also very interesting because we were talking about cats many times today, which is amazing. And I just saw this meme today, this morning, which says that I think it's very funny to see the poster that my cat got lost. Cats are never lost. They just leave you. So it's very interesting that if we see cats as never-ending nomads, which are traveling from place to place, and it's also the place that invites you to take a moment and sort of be as a cat and just then continue your journey without this ending point of your journey, sort of. So yeah, it's just some things that came to me while I saw it first in announcement of the show, and then I saw it today live. But it's also reminds, it makes me think about a place of initiation. And your video also makes me think about it because it kind of happens in the desert, and desert is quite a familiar place to have an insight and to be initiated into something. And if it's so, and sorry, it's just my sort of perception of your work, and if it resonates with you, and if it could be a place of initiation, what kind of initiation you think it could be? Thank you.
Vicky was calling this a feline temple, right? So maybe it's the cult of cats, but I mean, it's interesting that you bring up the nomadism in it. That was something I was thinking about. I think I was reading N.K. Jemisin's Broken Kingdom, her trilogy, but there's a moment where they're all kind of itinerant, and I was thinking about the structure as like both the kind of blanket forts that kids make to make their own kind of world within a world that their parents have made, but also just like these things that are makeshift and can be put up in times of apocalypse that somehow bring some small measure of comfort. But I don't think I was thinking of any specific initiation, like indoctrination. Although I did, when I was a kid, I did want to be a cult leader. So maybe that's in there.
Also, one just fun fact about this 10, I don't know that we've talked about it. I think you may have alluded to it, Candice, is that it's all modular. And so it all comes apart, and then there are some panels that have these circular holes. And so those are meant to be worn as well. So they can also be capes and then also become the structure, which I think is super interesting.
Okay. Any other comments or questions?
When you mentioned that it's kind of like a cat experience, I totally saw that. We poked our heads up through the holes. The moment you said it, I was like, we definitely looked like little cats. And I definitely relate to your idea of being so self-expressive in art feels very like decadent and kind of like you're cheating because you feel like you want to make something that, you know, is reflecting something else. And I like going to school for art, I feel very selfish that I'm like taking the time. And I was wondering, now that you've taken this step in your art, do you feel like you'll be more comfortable doing that in your future work?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's going in that direction. Yeah.
So thank you for the fabulous art. I have not even seen anything except from this sitting position. And I'm deeply moved by the tactility of things. And I honestly, I would like to take a piece off and wear it or drape one as a sari. And even the holes, it's making me think, what if a sari, you know, the 6-yard fabric that we wind around ourselves, if that had a hole, that would have more options of wearing it. So I'm very inspired by the art. And I'm also very moved by the title, Seeping, Rotting, Resting, Weeping. Is that supposed to be a symmetry, seeping and weeping, rotting and resting?
I kind of forget how the title came about, but I mean, I think we were trying to think of something that encapsulated what I hoped would be the experience of the exhibition, but also like my experience of the years in the pandemic while I was making it. So there's the sense of the grief, but also the solitude and moments of stewing in your own juices and fermenting, and but also different paces of time.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I guess this is more of a comment than a question, but I just wanted to say thank you for this work, but also for speaking about your embarrassment so openly, and even the resistance that you brought in not answering the questions or acknowledging that you don't know how to respond. I think that in the space of an institution, we expect everyone to be an expert and to have all the answers. And so just opening up that space of just the openness of the not knowing or of the not having something that can be verbalized yet is so wonderful, because so much of that is what we experience when we look at art or experience art. And opening up that space of embarrassment is so vulnerable and also so meaningful and important. So thank you for that.
Hi, thank you for all of this. I have a kind of a random memory that came to my mind, especially when you were talking about the non-human perspective, the way that this opens up the possibility of seeing from a cat's perspective or thinking about what the world is like. Those first few months, very briefly they went by, of the pandemic, when everyone was so interested in the way that humanity seemed to be on the retreat for a little while, and all of the animal world and the natural world was starting to come out. And I specifically remember hearing people from the Getty talking about in LA, we hear the birds now, animals are coming onto the streets, the nature of the sky is changing. And I feel like, I mean, when I for example, think of weirding, the word of weirding, the other thing that comes to my mind is like Timothy Morton and the idea of looking at the world not from a human perspective, the way that it makes sense to us or the way that we use it, but trying to imagine the combinations and the uses and the experiences of things if you don't think of it from a utilitarian perspective, or potentially if you think of it from a non-human perspective. And so I just adored the video in the tent, and I loved the way that it opened up to that. And I just thought about that moment when it felt like many people were starting to think, how do we see? What is this world when we're in retreat? So it resonated with the early months of the pandemic for me in a really powerful way. So thank you.
I wanted to say I live in Altadena, so it's close to the mountains. And actually during that first summer, we had black bears and coyotes coming down. And the coyotes, like, because I have all these feral cats and my cat, I'm a little always worried when they're showing up, but they would come onto my porch and hang out, and White and Gray would just be there, and they would be like licking his bowl and like kind of chilling. And first I chased them, but then I was like, I guess they're okay. But yeah, that did happen.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. These were wonderful comments, I must say. And thank you, the three of you. So you're free to chat further or spend more time in the exhibition or whatever. Okay.